Confident the rollout can begin next year.
That will obviously start with the health workers, and if approvals are granted for the elderly, the work of the medical expert panel is not surprisingly, it's common sense in Australia, but it's also common with what's happening around the world. Identified health workers and the elderly as their priority, and our expectation is that all Australians who seek it will be given access to a free vaccine on a voluntary basis during the course of 2021. We have 4 vaccines that we've purchased, and we've done that to make sure that no matter what the outcomes of particular vaccines were, that we were covered. But we also cover 3 different classes of vaccines. So we have the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, 33.8 million units. That's a viral vector vaccine. We have the Novavax vaccine, which is 40 million units. It's a more classical protein vaccine, as is the Australian-made CSL molecular clamp, where we have 51 million units, and 10 million units of the Pfizer mRNA. What it does mean is that we'll have a variety of options, and that we're on track to deliver first vaccines on the latest advice, having just spoken with the AstraZeneca CEO for Australia last night, in March. So there's been no final decision, but we've been clear, and I've given guidance previously, that we would expect that people coming to Australia, whilst COVID-19 is a significant disease in the world, will either be vaccinated or they'll isolate. That's early guidance. It's not a formal decision that we've taken, because it's still not at that time. At this stage, everybody who comes has to quarantine. The likely course of events during 2021 is if somebody comes to Australia and a vaccine is widely available, either they'll be vaccinated with verification or they'll have to quarantine.
The AstraZeneca vaccine data comes after positive stage 3 trials from Pfizer and Moderna. Here's how they compare. The Moderna vaccine showed 95% efficacy. 30,000 people took part in the trial, but this initial data came from analysis of the first 95 people to develop symptoms. The Pfizer candidate showed similar promising results. 43,000 people took part in 6 countries. Again, the data presented is from the first 94 volunteers to develop symptoms. And as we've heard today, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was trialled on 20,000 volunteers in Brazil and the UK. All of the stage 3 vaccine trials required 2 doses. These were given 4 weeks apart in the Moderna trials and 3 weeks apart for Pfizer. As for the differing results for the AstraZeneca-Oxford trials, 2 full doses gave 62% protection. A half dose followed by a full dose was 90%. Overall, the trial showed 70% protection. Obviously, transporting and storing enough vaccine to immunise billions of people around the world is the main challenge for producers. This is where the AstraZeneca vaccine leaps ahead of the others. It can be stored between 2 to 8 degrees, which is the standard fridge temperature. Moderna's will be required to stay at -20 degrees and will last for up to 6 months. While the main challenge Pfizer faces is developing transport mechanisms that keep it at -70 degrees Celsius. Cost is also in AstraZeneca's favour, especially for budget-constrained governments looking at mass vaccination programs. That's mainly down to the producer's no-profit pledge. It's expected to come in at $5.50 compared to Moderna's at more than $45. The technology used by AstraZeneca is also more established, so the vaccine is easier to mass-produce cheaply. Both Moderna and Pfizer developed an RNA-based vaccine, meaning part of the coronavirus's genetic code is injected into the body, which is enough to train the immune system to attack. So this is the 3rd separate vaccine trial that has delivered positive results, and if you found that's prompted more questions than answers, the ABC's online team has put together an article detailing how these developments may affect you. That's one of the top stories on our website, news.abc.net.au. The Transport Workers Union says training and the lack of protective equipment needs to be addressed in the food delivery industry after the death of a delivery rider in inner Sydney last night. The cyclist died in Redfern after being hit by a truck carrying an excavator. He's the 5th delivery rider to die on the job in the nation in the last 2 months. For more, I'm joined by Alex Veen, who's a lecturer in employment relations at the University of Sydney Business School. Alex Veen, thank you for your time tonight. Was this
Thanks
to
for
be
that.
expected that this job would become more precarious and more dangerous given that more people are staying at home and ordering in?
Thanks, Karina. And firstly, I would like to express my condolences to the families of the 5 workers. And to answer your question, yes, it's not entirely surprising that we've seen a rise in incidents, particularly in the last few months as a result of COVID. We've seen a considerable increase in the number of people using these services. But at the same time, what we've also witnessed is an increasing number of people who have turned to the industry as a source of income, with many workers, particularly temporary migrants, excluded, for instance, from the JobKeeper package. So we've seen a rise in the number of workers competing for a limited number of deliveries that are available. And I think it's quite critical that we understand that there are a number of factors associated here, and the limited amount of work that is available is one of the issues, exacerbating the issues.
And is that what makes them so vulnerable, that lack of protection that they have?
So I would argue that what we're seeing is, on the one hand side, the vulnerability in terms of the type of transport that they're using. So obviously cycling infrastructure in cities like Sydney are perhaps not ideal, but at the same time, the vulnerability is exacerbated by other factors that relate to the business models that these platforms use, particularly these piece rate systems.
Are workplace deaths on the rise as a result?
Well, we can clearly see that there is a trend here. So we've seen 5 deaths in the last 3 months, which is a significant increase. But before that, we already saw quite a number of incidents in terms of safety, workers being harassed on the streets, being assaulted by members of the public. So it's definitely not a safe job.
Do you think if this number of deaths had happened in such a short period of time, say in the construction sector, there'd be a much bigger outcry over it? Is it because these people are, as you say, migrant workers with fewer rights that we don't see that sort of outcry?
Well, I think we are actually seeing a considerable amount of outcry at the moment about these deaths, and they're very tragic. But what we can see is that in other industries that have high number of migrant workers, like horticulture, it's not that uncommon that these deaths and these injuries are not given the same level of visibility. But I do think it's very important that we're having these discussions and we're talking about it now. And clearly there's something that needs to happen, and there's an opportunity for regulators to step in and put in place some measures to ensure that these workers are better protected.
Yeah, what better regulations could be put in place?
Well, I think one of the issues with the food delivery sector is that we have these ongoing discussions about whether these workers who are currently often engaged as independent contractors rather than employees, this sort of binary discussion is not necessarily helpful for them at the moment, and thus far the Fair Work Commission has sort of upheld these classifications, but regulators could think about some more sectoral-based approaches. So ensuring, firstly, that there are opportunities for these platforms to provide at least basic safety training, to ensure that workers are provided with safety equipment, making sure that when there are workplace injuries or deaths, that these workers and their families have access to adequate workers' compensation and insurance. And lastly, I think we also need to look more fully under the sort of working conditions and earnings of these workers and have some greater transparency around the pressures that these individuals are facing.
And in terms of compensation and insurance, I think probably a lot of Australians would be shocked that when someone who's working in these roles dies on the job, there's very limited compensation payouts that the companies are expected to pay out.
Well, one of the things is that we have seen some shifts in the sector, and so it varies very much from platform to platform. So some platforms have recognized that there is a need for them to provide some basic insurance for their workers, but they only can access it if they are actually undertaking a delivery for that specific platform. One of the issues is that we see that these workers work on multiple platforms interchangeably or sometimes even at the same time. And so So really what we need to have is a situation where it's not just one or two providing benefits to workers and others basically able to absolve themselves from it. We need to have a coherent approach to ensure that every one of these workers, if they are injured at the job or in these very tragic circumstances, that there are adequate sort of measures and compensation mechanisms in place.
Alex Veen, really good to get your thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Karina.
The Victorian Government will offer stamp duty discounts and spend close to $50 billion on other concessions, subsidies and projects. The state's Treasurer has handed down his 2020 budget, which he hopes will get people back to work and breathe new life into the battered economy. Dan Ziffer has more from Melbourne.
This is a big spending budget. Money is very cheap, and so the Victorian Government has gone out and will blow its debt out to $155 billion in 4 years' time from now. They're going to spend that money trying to prompt an economic recovery now that will float the state and get it out of the position it finds itself. The government does suggest that unemployment will hit 8 and a bit percent, almost a full percentage point above 7.4 where it is at the moment. As a result, it has a really comprehensive and expensive jobs plan. It wants to create 400,000 jobs from the low of where we've been in the next couple of years. It's going to do that through things like a direct wage subsidy. So if you spend $1 more than you currently do on wages, you'll get 10% of that back. And that's on top of existing federal government subsidies. So some really detailed and very expensive programs trying to get Victorians back to work, not just directly as in employed for the government, but trying to get private enterprise to kind of take up the cudgel as well. Tim Pallas, the Treasurer, spoke about that briefly in Parliament this afternoon.
It focuses on those most impacted by this pandemic: women, young people, older Victorians, and Victorians who have plenty of experience but don't always have a qualification. This government understands the dignity, the independence, the self-respect, the sense of belonging and contribution that work gives us. Our jobs plan will start this journey to get Victoria working. It will drive economic and social recovery by putting Victorians at its heart. It will build our state as we rebuild our economy. It will support our industries and leverage our strengths. It will leave no Victorian behind.
So the government has a really ambitious target, which, as I noted, is to get 400,000 people into employment who weren't there at the low point earlier this year. So the aim is to essentially reboot the economy, to generate employment and generate movement of money such as that it can float the revenue of the state. So we've already seen the economy has contracted by 4% this year. That's $16 billion that just didn't happen in Victoria. But the government wants to push that to really push the recovery itself. It's got some really pointed lessons for the federal government, who have chosen stimulus of just very specific programs. Here the Victorian government has essentially thrown a fire hose of cash to almost everything they do. There's $20 billion of infrastructure every year. There's huge amounts being spent directly to employ people in mental health, in tutoring to get students back after 2 months at 2 terms of missing school, and a really direct approach to employing Victorians in the aim of really pushing that economic recovery and making it happen faster here.
US President-elect Joe Biden has been given the formal go-ahead to begin his transition to the White House after he was certified the winner in the battleground state of Michigan. The move from a Trump-appointed administrator paves the way for Mr Biden's team to receive federal funds, an official office and national security briefings. Joe Biden has also been announcing key members of his foreign policy and national security team. Former Secretary of State John Kerry, who signed the Paris Climate Agreement on behalf of the US in 2016, will be the new climate envoy. Avril Haines, a former Deputy Director of the CIA, will be the first woman to lead the intelligence community. And longtime Biden aide Antony Blinken will take up the most important foreign policy position, Secretary of State. Joe Biden is also reportedly planning to appoint former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen as the next Treasury Secretary. The top stories on ABC News. Queensland will open its border to all of New South Wales from next week. People living in Greater Sydney have faced restrictions travelling north of the border since August. Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk says there'll be an update on travellers from Victoria tomorrow. The first Australians could be vaccinated against coronavirus as early as March. The University of Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine has become the third treatment shown to be effective in clinical trials. Doses of the vaccine are already being manufactured in Melbourne in anticipation of regulatory approval. The Transport Workers Union says the federal government needs to set up an inquiry into food delivery companies after the death of a fifth rider on Australian roads in just 2 months. The man was killed after being hit by a truck in Redfern in inner Sydney last night. The union says urgent reform is needed to ensure food delivery companies protect workers. And Donald Trump still refuses to concede defeat in the US election as the presidential transition process officially begins. Joe Biden now has access to $8 million in funds, and federal agencies can begin working with members of his team to smooth the way for a handover. Despite this, President Trump insists court cases challenging the election results will continue. Liberal MP and former SAS captain Andrew Hastie